Introduction. Socio-economic and political changes occurred in Western Europe between the 9th and 16th centuries. After the fall of the Roman Empire, many groups of Germanic people occupied regions of Italy, Spain, and France. The three orders are three social categories: Christian priests, landowning nobles, and peasants. The term feudalism has been used by historians to describe the economic, legal, political, and social relationships that existed in Europe in the medieval era. Important sources of the three orders. The first one is a Benedictine monk working on a manuscript. Rules followed by the monks. In Benedictine monasteries, there was a manuscript with 73 chapters of rules which were followed by the monks from many centuries. Here are some of the rules that they had to follow. Chapter 6. Permission to speak should rarely be granted to monks. Chapter 7. Humility means obedience. Chapter 33. No monk should own private property. Chapter 47. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, so friars and sisters should be occupied at certain times in manual labor and at fixed hours in sacred reading. Chapter 48. The monastery should be let out in such a way that all necessities be found within its bounds, for example, water, mill, garden, workshops, etc. The second important source is Stained Glass Window, Chartres Cathedral, France, 15th century. The three orders. The first order, the clergy. France, under the ancient regime before the French Revolution, divided society into three estates. The first estate, clergy. The first estate was the clergy, who were people, including priests, who ran both the Catholic Church and some aspects of the country. In addition to keeping registers of births, deaths, and marriages, the clergy also had the power to levy a 10% tax known as the tithe. Monks, a group of deeply religious individuals who choose to live in seclusion, are known as monks. They lived in religious communities known as abbeys or monasteries, which were frequently located in remote areas devoid of human habitation. Men became monks and women nuns. Like priests, monks and nuns also did not marry. They spent their time in worship, study, and manual labor like farming. Monks vowed to stay in abbey for the rest of their life. The church and society. Though Europeans became Christian, they still held on to some of their old beliefs in magic and folk traditions. Christmas and Easter became important dates from the 4th century. Overworked peasants welcomed holy days. Holy days or holidays because they were not expected to work then. These days were meant for prayers, but people usually spent a good part of time having fun and feasting. Many people went on long journeys to shrines of martyrs or to big churches. The second order, the nobility. The nobility had a central role in social processes because they controlled land. This control was the outcome of a practice called vassalage. The kings of France were linked to the people by vassalage. The big landowners, the nobles, were vassals of the king, and the peasants were vassals of the landowners. The nobles enjoyed a privileged status. He had absolute control over his property. He could raise troops called feudal levies. The lord held his own court of justice and could even coin his own money. He was the lord of the people, settled on his land. He owned vast tracts of land which contained his own dwellings, his private fields and pastures, and the homes of his tenant peasants. The manorial estate. A lord has his own manor house. A small manorial estate could contain a dozen families, while larger estates might include 50 or 60 families. Almost everything needed for daily life was found in the estate. The estate had extensive woodlands and forests where the lords hunted. There were pastures for cattle and horses. There was a church and a castle for defense. The knights. From the 9th century, there were frequent localized wars in Europe. The amateur peasant soldiers were not sufficient and good cavalry was needed. This led to the growing importance of a new section of people, the knights. The Lord gave the knight a piece of land which was called fief and promised to protect it. A fief could be inherited. The fief contained house for the knight and his family, a church and other establishments. It also had a watermill and a wine press. The land of the fief was cultivated by peasants. In exchange, the knight paid a regular fee to his lord and promised to fight for him in war. A knight was free to serve more than one lord, but his foremost loyalty was to serve his own lord. The third order, peasants. Peasants are of two types, free peasants and serfs. The third order, peasants comprise the third order. There were two types of peasants, free peasants and serfs. Free peasants. The free peasants held their farms as tenants of the lord. They had to render military service at least 40 days per year. Peasant families had to devote 3 or more days of the week to work at the lord's estate. The output from such labor was called labor rent, which would go directly to the lord. The kings sometimes imposed a direct tax style on peasants. Serfs. The serfs cultivated the land which belonged to the lord. Much of the produce from such land went to the lord. They received no wages and could not leave the estate without the lord's permission. Serfs could use only their lord's mill, oven, and wine presses. The lord could decide whom a serf could marry. The lord might give his blessings to the serf's choice, but on payment of a fee. Hardships faced by the peasants. The peasants were at the bottom of the feudal system and had to obey their local lord, to whom they had sworn an oath of obedience on the Bible. Because they had sworn an oath to their lord, it was taken for granted that they had sworn a similar oath to the duke, earl, or baron who found that lord's property. The lifestyle of a medieval peasant in the medieval England was extremely hard and harsh. Many worked as farmers in fields owned by the lords, and their lives were controlled by the farming year. Certain jobs had to be done at certain times of the year. Their lives were harsh, but there were few rebellions due to a hard system of law and order. Land use. Agricultural technology was primitive. Wooden plough drawn by a team of oxen was used by peasants. The wooden plough could only scratch the surface of the earth. Field had to be dug by hand, usually once in 4 years. Additionally, an ineffective method of crop rotation was in use. The land was divided into 2 halves. One field was planted in autumn with winter wheat, while the other was left fallow. This system resulted in a gradual deterioration of soil. Famines and chronic malnutrition was quite common. But the lords wanted to maximize their income. The peasants were forced to bring under cultivation all the land in the manorial estate and spend more time on the manorial estate. The peasants resorted to passive resistance. They spent more time on their fields and kept much of the product of that labor for themselves. The peasants also avoided doing unpaid extra work. They came into conflict with the lords over pasture and forest lands. The peasants saw such resources meant for the whole community, while the lords treated them as their own property. Conclusion. The Three Orders chapter describes about the socio-economic and political changes which occurred in Western Europe between the 9th and 16th centuries. After the fall of the Roman Empire, many groups of Germanic people from Eastern and Central Europe occupied regions of Italy, Spain, and France. In the absence of any unifying political force, military conflict was frequent, and the need to gather resources to protect one's land became very necessary. Social organization was therefore centered on the control of land. Its features were derived from both Imperial Roman traditions and German customs. Christianity, the official religion of the Roman Empire from the 4th century, survived the collapse of Rome and gradually spread to Central and Northern Europe. This church also became a major landholder and political power in Europe. The Three Orders, the focus of this chapter, are 3 social categories: Christian priests, landowning nobles, and peasants. The changing relationships between these three groups was an important factor in shaping European history for several centuries. Thank you.